Stop at 2:15.
Sure. All right. Well, we're live. We are live. All right. So, welcome everyone. We are back, Margaret Kimberley and I, for another episode of the Left Lens Live. So, you know the drill, like the stream, subscribe to the channel, hit that notifications bell as you're coming in if you're new to the channel. But of course, everyone, please do like the stream. We're going to be on for about an hour today. And yeah, we wanted to, I think, Margaret, you've had these articles the last couple of weeks that I think are important to talk about. One was first on Jayland Walker, who was a black male who was killed by Akron police brutally. I mean, absolutely brutally for a so-called traffic violation. I believe he was shot more than 90 times, and then 60 of the bullets hit his body. So he was massacred in the streets of Akron. And yeah, I was wondering if you wanted to start up there and talk about some of the points you wanted to make, because I think what struck me was that there was outrage, there were protests locally, and I guess some outside. It wasn't, we're 2 years out of the uprisings of 2020,
Mm-hmm.
right? So just a little bit over 2 years ago, we had millions of people. Now it seems like that energy has dissipated in many respects, and you had some I guess, points and criticisms about the kind of outrage and how we are reacting to things like Jayland Walker's brutal murder. So yeah, I don't know if you wanted to start there.
Sure. We should protest. So there in Akron, Ohio, obviously there were and are protests over a murder. I mean, that's the only word you can use to describe it. Even the police version of events doesn't hold water. They claim he shot at them, but there's no proof that he did. He was running away from them, which means not posing a danger to them by definition. But these cops are trigger happy. And this is inevitable because Black people are over policed. And a traffic stop can turn into death for Black people. So you have trigger happy cops. They're hyped up. They know their job is to control Black people, especially. So they're ready to use violence. That's their modus operandi. And so inevitably there will be a Jayland Walker, but there's a Jayland Walker every single day. A Black person is killed by the police on average every day. 3 people in total are killed by the police every day, more than 1,000 people every year. And that number doesn't change. It doesn't budge. So it's important to speak up and advocate for him to get some sort of justice, although we already know that's unlikely. The numbers of times that police are prosecuted for killing people, it's, you can count on one hand. So while it's important to be outraged by the particulars of an individual case, we cannot forget about policing in general. The mass incarceration system is fed by the police. Police kill with impunity. I know people made a big deal about Congress passing anti-lynching legislation. Well, the lynchers now are the police. So, but there's no legislation to control their actions. So I just wanted to point out those things and the need for systemic change. We talked about, after George Floyd was killed in 2020, defunding the police or community control of the police. And we've already seen how defunding the police was, while well-intentioned, not a good demand, because you either had situations like here in New York City, for example, where they did some accounting changes and claimed to have defunded the police. Here it was, they took security staff who were in the schools, and they took those budget lines out of the NYPD and put it in the education department and said, see, we cut the police budget. But they didn't change policing. That's the demand, to change policing, to stop the over-policing, to stop police from responding to things that they don't need to respond to, like people in mental health crises who are likely to be killed if someone calls 911. So the argument should have been about policing itself. Community control of the police is a valid demand, but you can't have that. You can't have community control of the police unless we have real democracy and people have control over other aspects of the state. So it's important to keep all those things in mind and to advocate for things that will stop this carnage, and not to be, I feel like people are lulled. I don't know how many, for a while, this, every, they said it was 28 hours. We may as well say 24. I think it's pretty clear now. 24 Black person killed by the police every 24 hours. And people forget because there's not a big case. You don't see George Floyd being killed, begging for his life. You don't see the video of this young man being shot 60 times. And people, go, not completely unaware, but are not activated until there's a case that makes headlines. And so I wanted to raise that and raise the issue and the question about what do we do about this aside from protesting in an individual case.
Yeah, no, those are really good points, and it makes me think about why is there more of a lull now? Why is it? Because even we had this problem in 2020. We
Mhm.
had kind of we had more people protesting, but we did have kind of like the incoherency that you're talking about. The demands were not. There was some concrete. The one concrete demand was defund the police. But that concrete demand is very broad still, right? It could be interpreted in many different ways. And there was no push for the community control that you talked about to ensure that whatever defunding meant was actually going to resolve the problem and actually get to the root of the problem, which is that the police are organized to do exactly what they did to George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, on and on and on, Philando Castillo, all the way into Jayland Walker's brutal murder. And so what's the difference? One big difference that not many people will talk about is that during the uprisings of 2020, Donald Trump was president, and there was already a lot of, it was toward the end of his presidency. There had already been scandal after scandal, some less legitimate than others, Rushgate, all of that, all that conspiracy and all of that. There was a lot of, you could say, liberal posturing and condemnation of Trump while allowing him to do whatever served them and their interests. But then then Joe Biden became president, and we've had just, I think, across the board, less activity in terms of people on the left, people who maybe call themselves social justice activists, peace activists, anti-police brutality. I feel like it's smaller, and it's also less directed toward the upper echelons of government, being the commander in chief. I don't know. What are your thoughts about that? That's something that I've noticed just observing this period. I mean, we're in this huge moment of crisis.
Yeah, I think you're right. There tends to be the last time before 2020, there were the last time there was a lot of mass action was right before the Iraq War. And it turned out to be in 2003, but it turned out to be an anti-Bush protest because Obama came along and, he was marketed as this peace candidate, which of course he wasn't. First of all, the war did take place. And then there was this, a lot of it was anti-Bush. It was anti-Republican. And I think you're right about 2020. A lot of the anger was directed at Trump and not at the system itself. I also think that the fact that it was an election year, people in this country, even people who consider themselves activists, live and die by presidential elections. And I think that took the energy, the air out of the room. And it was all about getting rid of Trump. People were Trump obsessed, are still Trump obsessed. And a lot of that's driven by the Democratic Party in order to distract people from the things that they do. But I think you're right. So if there's a Republican in office, there's more likely to be action in the streets than if not. I forgot what I was going to say. So yes, it's partly driven by electoral politics. It's driven by liberalism. And even people who consider themselves radical in this country are often just liberals. And they want reform. They want change. They genuinely do. But they want some kind of reform, and they hope that the policing will change across the country. So that means that the movement can be defeated with posturing. So taking a knee in 2020, which Colin Kaepernick began, and then in 2020, everybody took a knee. There were cops taking a knee, CEOs taking a knee. Joe Biden took a knee in a black church, of course. Members of Congress, it was disgraceful, wearing kente cloth. It was the most ridiculous thing. Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and, kneeling in Congress for, 8 minutes or whatever the number of minutes were that it took George Floyd to die. It was horrible and should have been condemned. But as long as the call is for reform, movement can be easily defeated. I also think that people don't really understand how movements work and what you actually have to do to bring about change. So, for example, everybody, fetishizes the liberation movement, what is commonly called the civil rights movements of the 60s, early 70s. But nobody talks about how that happened. People made constant demands. They didn't have friends in government, which I think is a good thing, probably. They made demands knowing that nobody wanted to meet them, but they were consistent and over many years and organized. There was organization. So those things didn't exist in 2020. And you also had a lot of people apologizing. I remember a lot of Black people were at pains to say if someone in Minnesota, where George Floyd was killed, someone set the police precinct on fire, which actually spurred those cops getting arrested, I am convinced. But a lot of people said, well, we're not the ones who set the fire. It probably was a white person or it was somebody from out of town. And instead of understanding that act, an act that's dangerous. I'm not telling people to go out and do that, but that is the kind of thing that can spur change in that case, because they were trying not to treat this as an ordinary, what is ordinary for the police in killing Black people, and that they would get away with not arresting those cops. So I think it was electoral politics, liberalism, lack of organization, lack of an understanding of radicalism. All of those things combined to fizzle the movement out. And then, of course, Biden wins. And that was everybody's dream. Hello, Trump is gone. And, as if Trump being in office was the only thing wrong with the country, as if nobody was killed by the police before Trump was president.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, Black Lives Matter, the first iteration happened during the Obama administration. I mean, that was 2014. That was the first big wave. But there is a historical forgetfulness that does pervade the United States, certainly. And you wrote about in your latest article about kind of this legacy of the counterintelligence program, because that plays a huge role still, I think, in the ways in which people react, organizations, but especially just people trying to find their way and react to these instances of injustice. I mean, the counterintelligence program, the history of it, the way that the FBI and related intelligence agencies did redirect and did violently seek to control, repress, and really destroy social movements of that period that you were talking about, that's had a huge impact into today. And you talk about entrapment now. You talk about a gentleman, Romeo Langhorne, suffer from mental illness. You talked about how he was entrapped by the FBI and now he's going to serve a 20-year prison sentence. Could you talk more about that? And yeah, what's important about it? Like, why should we be talking about this particular issue that has affected this young Black man, but now really is affecting so many people across this country?
Well, this is the counterintelligence program was used to crush the liberation movement, killing people, getting people to kill each other, imprisoning people. The United States has the longest serving political prisoners of any country in the world. People now in their 70s and 80s who've been in jail 50 years. So I think it's important to remember that is that is how the movement was destroyed. And it was destroyed because it was so successful, by the way. So it's important to keep that in mind. But this kind of entrapment is something that never went away, but it began to accelerate after September 11th, 2001. And the targets are usually Muslims of various ethnicities. And if Americans, Black Americans who may be Muslims. There are numerous cases like this case of Romeo Langhorne. As soon as I read about it in the paper, I knew it was phony. So, for example, we have this man who was online and chatting with other people. The FBI had him under surveillance since 2014. And an informant contacted him. The informant instigated him saying he wanted to show people how to build a bomb. The government created the actual video, and that's what he's sentenced for uploading a bomb video, not for having a bomb, not for setting off a bomb, not for threatening anybody, but for uploading a video of a bomb making video. And they directed him. The case had gone cold. He hadn't contacted the informant. The informant instigates again. And the government creates a video for him to upload. And then they arrest him. And now he's going to be in jail for 20 years. There are cases like the Newburgh Four, where these four men were instructed to bring up what was a bomb to a synagogue. They thought they were just going to get money. They had, and it was a usual thing, this informant hung around a mosque in Newburgh, New York, which is north of New York City. People who were very marginal, semi-employed, unemployed, who thought they were going to con this guy and get money. The Liberty City, I think it's 7 from Miami, who did nothing. They were recorded taking a pledge. It was supposed to be a pledge to Al-Qaeda, and they were going to blow up the Sears Tower. It took them 3 trials to finally convict them, hung juries twice, and then they kicked a juror off who they felt who during deliberation, and finally got their conviction. But there was no crime committed there. So those are the more famous cases, but there are lots of several hundred people in jail across the country who are victims of these entrapments. And you have to ask what the motive is. And and the motive is to keep people afraid, to get buy-in, to target the people who are most despised by society. And then you get buy-in for war, you get buy-in for surveillance. I mean, look at what's happened to us since September 11th. Congress voted to go to war against Afghanistan, which hadn't attacked the US, by the way. We're told that the leaders of the plotters were in Afghanistan, so the US had to invade Afghanistan. So Congress voted like 3 or 4 days after September 11th. So without any real deliberation, without thinking about it. They were rushed into it. I think a lot of them were just afraid politically to say no. Only one member of Congress said no, Barbara Lee, who since then has devolved politically, to be perfectly honest. Now she's running back and forth to Ukraine, talking about, evil Russia. And we had the Patriot Act. And remember, the Patriot Act was going to be temporary. Well, they renew it with regularity. So the government has rights to surveil us. The NSA keeps track of all our electronic communications, all. So they have a record of every email, phone call, text message, all. And this has been going on for the past 20 years. And these phony prosecutions, these use of informants to get people like Mr. Langhorne, who is also said to have been schizophrenic. So the most marginal people are the targets. Of course, who else would go along with these things? And then they are entrapped into committing crimes, but the crimes are concocted by the government. And it's something that's flown under the radar for a while. So I thought it was good to write about it again.
Right. I mean, it's so true. It really is. I mean, it's really such a problem to see just what last week the FBI and the MI5 came out and said China is the big threat to everything domestically, especially the economy. But everything that you just spelled out has been so normalized, right? The loss of any kind of whatever privacy was in the United States, it's gone, and it's been gone for now more than 2 decades. One of Barack Obama's signature, you could call it a broken promise, but everything he promised was really a half promise. He never really did make any firm commitments, but he did say he would get rid of the worst stipulations of the Patriot Act, and all he did was sign off on it again and actually add on to it in subsequent policies, like tacking on really crazy clauses on the National Defense Authorization Act that gives the military the right to indefinitely detain U.S. citizens. We're not even talking about the terror that Obama and now Biden, Trump and Biden all deployed on people who are considered non-citizens, aka undocumented people who are not considered legal immigrants here in the United States or legally residing. It's absolutely criminal, but all of this has been so normalized, and it really does pose the question, well, who's the real threat here? Because it seems like it's the FBI and the police departments and the whole national security state, which is trying to actually create the problem that it says it's seeking to solve. That's what a lot of entrapment is all about. We are going to make the problem, make the terrorist threat, make the scenario so that we can legitimize the campaign, we can legitimize the policy. And that should really, not only disgust people, make them infuriated, but also it should really be a red flag as to, well, what is actually the threat here? Is it the country thousands of miles away that only talks about, hey, can we cooperate? Can we have some peace here? Or is it the government, the national security state, which is actively suppressing independent media, actively spying on everybody just for the hell of it, just for the purpose of social control? I mean, to me, it's just so obvious what the answer is, but the propaganda blitz about this to normalize the policies and then to scapegoat someone else, another country, whatever it is it's just baffling. And then also the targeting of people with mental illness is just sickening, because someone who has schizophrenia, they suffer from delusions and or hallucinations generally, not all the time, especially when you get older. I've worked with a lot of people. Once you get older, it's mostly some other symptoms, kind of like they call it negative symptoms. So people who are like maybe kind of rigid. Maybe they have like a low affect all of the time, those kind of things. But usually younger people like Mr. Langhorn would have some active delusions and would be very vulnerable to manipulation. And it happens all the time just on the streets. But to know that and I know police departments have done this, I've seen, like, they will target people who suffer from these problems and manipulate them into risking their lives. Really, I mean, you're basically sending someone like Romeo Langhorn either to prison or to their death, because whatever happens in the entrapment, it's anybody's guess. It could
Yep.
be an arrest, but it could also be that you just die there.
Yeah, and and another thing that's important is nobody is ever acquitted in these cases. We don't have a just criminal justice system. Actually, in most criminal cases, the prosecution wins. It's rare for people to plead innocent and beat the charge in any charge. And in these cases, the federal government puts the full weight on these cases. These are people who can't mount I mean, you'd have to be a millionaire to mount a successful defense to get the right legal team in place to beat these charges. And the courts have said that this entrapment is not entrapment, and therefore it's legal for the government to concoct these crimes. So everybody pleads guilty. And it's a smart thing to plead guilty, because if you lose, everybody cuts a deal. So let's say if he hadn't pled guilty, it might have been 40 years in prison or some other really draconian sentence. So I think it's important for people to remember that as well, to remember how the system really works to get people when they want to get them. And the informant testifies, and the individual usually is someone who should not testify in their own defense, like in this case. So, of course, he pled guilty. He didn't even go to trial. But of course, afterwards, they're like, this was very dangerous. He could have killed thousands of people. And I mean, it was the government's plot, not his. And I think that this should not be forgotten. It wasn't I had never heard of him until he was sentenced, and there were stories about this man being sentenced for 20 years. But I thought it was worth reminding people about how the state works.
Yeah, oftentimes we don't hear about these things. Even sometimes police murders, it will be weeks and weeks and weeks until video footage comes out, right? That was one of the things that during, I know, the Malcolm X grassroots movement, they were the first ones to document police murders of Black people. That's where we get these numbers like 36 hours, 28 hours, because they scoured the local media for, and this may be an undercount, because they scoured it for like identifiers of Black American, usually it's African American in mainstream media. So scouring for those terms and for whether, they were killed or not, or assaulted or what happened. And for a lot of them, all we've gotten is just a small dose of the most brutal cases and the ones that were caught on camera. And they found that a lot, of course, were not, and many were underreported. They were buried in the most local of the press, and you never hear about them. So I'm sure the same goes for entrapment, for everything else. You don't hear about it because it's not being covered in the way that it should be. And it's only when millions of people get onto the streets that you even get coverage. And now you have what is kind of like this absolutely pathetic pandering on the part of the establishment when it comes to politics of race and Black Lives Matter and all of that, and a lot of co-optation as well. But yeah, I don't know if you wanted to react to that.
Yeah, it's and the media it's really disgraceful. They just accept whatever police departments say, and they treat it as gospel truth and print what the police say. They don't they don't push back against anything that the police say. They help smear the victim who's dead and can't even speak up for themselves anymore. So these cases are often hidden, or if they're mentioned at all, or the press just go along with the propaganda, to use one of my favorite words. And I want to mention a case that came to light in the past week. Happened in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where the police allowed a 15-year-old kid to die of smoke inhalation. They were chasing a man. And of course, their first version is it was a federal warrant. It was this, it was that. No, it was nothing of the kind. It was something minor. He hadn't shown up for his parole. They chase the guy. He goes into this house. There's a teenage kid with him. They send a SWAT team. They send what am I saying? Gas canisters into the house. The house catches fire. There's a video of neighbors saying there's a kid in the house. Let him get out. And the police ignoring them. The kid is dead. The young man, what they wanted him for is something minor. Of course, they'll add a lot of charges to punish him. And the little boy, and I'm 15-year-old's a boy, I'll use that word. Turns out his father was killed by the police also. So it's a terrible story about the police and what they do and don't do. And I'm hoping that case is not one that's swept under the rug, and it's one that is given due attention.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely hope for that. Well, when you said that the police are kind of the principal voice, you have this also in other instances where the media just listens to the police, or the media, all of their sources are from cops or from anonymous intelligence agents. If usually we're talking about foreign policy here.
Mm-hmm.
Or like in the case of the Russia special military operation Ukraine, it's whatever Vladimir Zelensky says. It's whatever President Zelensky, whatever Ukraine government says. That's the whole truth and nothing but the truth. That's it. That is all that we're getting. We're getting the truth straight from the mouthpiece of the Ukraine government. So, I mean, how does this relate? I feel like this is a pattern, and it revolves around foreign policy too. I feel like there are such deep connections between how this empire sanitizes, propagandizes, and makes it so things like entrapment of someone like Romeo Langhorne or Jayland Walker's death, they do so much twists and turns to minimize the impact of those crimes. And I feel like that happens at the global scale too, where we are so misinformed and so misdirected that it's quite easy for a lot of people then to hear the FBI and the MI5 directors come together and say China's the threat, and then people say, oh yes, it's the threat, because nothing else that actually is criminal has been given any kind of attention to the same degree. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I think you're right. I'm old enough to remember when there would be some pushback, and in some cases, the media took the lead role in questioning the government and printing things the government didn't want to be seen. The Pentagon Papers, it wouldn't happen now. They're just mouthpieces. The New York Times is nothing, but they may as well get paychecks from the Biden administration. They don't report on anything. You can tell they don't report on anything without calling the White House first. And the same is true for the networks, the Washington Post, NPR, CNN, MSNBC, etc. They do not allow any other narrative to be seen or heard. If they talk about any other narrative, it's to disparage, it's to call someone a Russian dupe or Russian bot, all kinds of things, to accuse them of disinformation. That's the hot new word that the state actors use to disparage anybody who says anything other than what the government wants to say. So they've made China an enemy, and this is a continuation of Trump policy. Biden's policy is all Trump policy, except worse, I believe. So China is always the enemy. China is a threat. You shouldn't be on TikTok because the Chinese government has your, information about. What do they have about me that Google doesn't have about me? I'm sorry. It's like it's the same thing, but I'm supposed to be worried that I don't know, some information about me is in a database in Beijing. I don't care. It's no big deal. So that's how they get people to buy into whatever the state does. And while simultaneously Ukraine blew up in their faces, now they're trying to, and it's connected, they're trying to start something with China. So it's like they're trying to turn Taiwan into the next Ukraine and use it to get at this, so adversary, as they call it, air quotes, adversary country. And they are just obsessed with trying to assert U.S. hegemony, except it doesn't work. And they're endangering the whole world. The effort to sanction Russia is harming the whole world. You can't sanction just Russia. You can't punish just Russia. You can't damage Russia without damaging the rest of the world. And apparently they believe their own hype about Russia's economy being so small, and it's just a gas station masquerading as a country, as John McCain said.
Joe Biden said that too. All they have is
oil
gas
wells
and
and nukes.
they can't do anything with it. They can't do anything with it. Is what
right. And Obama saying Russia doesn't make anything. Well, it turns out Russia makes fertilizer, for example. And by kicking Russia out of the SWIFT system, there are countries all over the world who can't pay for the fertilizer. Russia's a major grain exporter. Countries can't, and they're trying to say Russia won't send its grain around the world. Well, the African Union chairman met with Vladimir Putin to try to figure out a way to pay for grain, and Russia wants to help them. So, that's just a part of this terrible policy. And the Europeans, what a bunch of little lapdogs. Germany has harmed itself irreparably. They depend on natural gas from Russia. But also, of course, this is an effort to force Europe to buy fracked gas from the US, which they literally don't even have the infrastructure to import. So it's a couple years down the road. It's more expensive. It's worse for the environment. All of these countries Europeans have done themselves in following the United States, and Russia and China are, and they always tell you, Russia's isolated. That's just a lie. Brazil just announced they're going to buy diesel from Russia. India, having screwed themselves and stopped buying Iranian oil when the Trump administration pressured them into doing it, are now in effect telling the US, we're going to buy oil from wherever we want. We're buying Russian oil. And so it's just catastrophe after catastrophe. As you pointed out in your latest column, that the US is the purveyor of chaos in the world. And that's where we are now. And we're being led by these people who are, and I know it's a crisis of capitalism, and I know that there are reasons for them to exercise their hegemony, but I want to say something else. These people are not smart at all. And that I think is something that makes them even more dangerous. And you see them do things. The propaganda, all propaganda has just been off the charts this whole year. You couldn't, it's less so now, but beginning in February, you could not open your computer for any reason without seeing a blue and yellow Ukrainian flag.
Oh, don't even get me started. When I visited Massachusetts, all around Boston, Cambridge area, if you go to anywhere which could be considered like a wealthier, liberal, mostly white community, it's generally white community, Ukraine flags everywhere. Anyway, continue. These are the kinds of people that are driving it. And they were pushing Zelensky down our throats. You couldn't watch the Grammy Awards. He was not on the Grammy. I was like, really? There's no escaping this guy. But that's all they have is propaganda, because Russia's winning. Russia has all of the Donbass is now under Russian control. Russia is methodically destroying Ukraine's military. These weapon systems, it's a joke, because and many, for example,
a lot of these weapon systems are complicated. You can't get it today and use it tomorrow. So it
Yeah,
could take
yeah.
weeks or months to be trained. Meanwhile, they have a lot of casualties. So it's literally a waste. A lot of these weapons are being sold on the black market in European countries.
Mm,
So this is a catastrophe, mostly for Ukraine, because people are dead.
yeah.
The only way out is to talk, which is what should have been happening anyway. To make good on the Minsk II agreement as the a unanimous vote in the UN Security Council, that could have kept this from happening. But they are determined, and the Biden administration hoped to instigate. What did Biden say? Because in his dementia, sometimes he'll blurt out things that are true. He said, "Well, if it's a little incursion, it's okay." And it's like, "Oh, so you are behind this?" But they
A
didn't tell.
little bit, a tidbit.
Yeah, but they didn't ask Putin. Putin was like, in for a penny, in for a pound. I'm going in and I'm going to settle this for good, because this has been going on since 2014, when the U.S. Led a coup against an elected president of Ukraine. And that this country, this kleptocracy, is being marketed as some little plucky little noble country. I mean, it's just absurd. Zelensky was put in office by an oligarch who was such a thief. He was sanctioned by the State Department. Zelensky's a multimillionaire. They said, well, it's not true he's a billionaire, but apparently he's worth like $500 million,
Oh,
which is how you get into power in Ukraine, by being in with the oligarchs there, who completely run Ukrainian politics. But I'm digressing a little bit, but I wanted to talk about something else. We both live in New York City, and a few days ago, the city's Office of Emergency Management posted this video about what to do in case of a nuclear attack in New York City. And first of all, it was just absurd. It was like, go inside, close the windows, and listen to media. And I was like, what media? There won't be any media. You won't have a window to close. You'll be dead if you're in New York. But I thought about it, was just very odd. And I am convinced that this is part of their propaganda campaign against Russia. I believe that, there it is. Yeah, PSA.
Do we dare listen to this? Is this something that's worth listening to?
Sure, let's do it, because it's absurd. So
It's
why
so
not?
absurd. I haven't yet, so let's see what it's like.
So there's been a nuclear attack. Don't ask me how or why, just know that the big one has hit, okay? So what do? There are 3 important steps that I want you to remember.
She said, don't ask me how or why. That's funny. That's really funny. Don't ask me how or why. It just did.
Step 1, get inside fast. You, your friends, your family, get inside. And no, staying in the car is not an option. You need to get into a building and move away from the windows. Step 2, stay inside. Shut all doors and windows. Have a basement? Head there. If you don't have one, get as far into the middle of the building as possible. If you were outside after the blast, get clean immediately. Remove and bag all outer clothing to keep radioactive dust or ash away from your body. Step 3, stay tuned. Follow media for more information. Don't forget to sign up for Notify NYC for official alerts and updates. And don't go outside until officials say it's safe. All right, you've got this.
Wow. Wow. You've got this.
I love the little pep talk at the end. It's like, what you say to a friend before they have a job interview. You got this. Everything looks like thermonuclear war, where New York would be a target. Nobody in New York is going to be. I mean, but having, aside from the ridiculousness of the commercial, the PSA, I just think it's odd. And I would love to know where this idea came from. I'm convinced it came from the Biden administration, and it's to make war acceptable to people. And all you have to do with, is just repeat something over and over again to get people to believe it. So they're evil countries, China and Russia, and they're trying to kill you. So don't question anything that the Biden administration says, because it's an anti-China Russia screed, in my opinion, and is used to legitimize American aggression around the world. So, I mean, people have laughed and joked about it, but I think it's also something very serious. And so we have this, and it's a funny thing about Biden. I remember during the campaign, people would ask me to be on these webinars about if there's a change of administration, what will change. And I always said, nothing much will change, but I was wrong. It's worse. Nobody was crossing China and Russian red lines like the Biden administration is.
Yeah.
And he is a weak president. He's incapacitated by dementia. Ordinarily, I wouldn't use a term like that since I'm not a medical professional, but there is something not right, not well about Joe Biden. And it becomes more and more obvious all the time. And he's surrounded by these people. And I mean, they're the people he wanted, obviously. These neocons who think that the U.S. can do anything it wants to do and get away with anything it wants to get away with. And that is just insanity. So Germany is talking about rationing energy, and businesses may shut down. And it's was the leading industrial nation in Europe until they, chose to be chumps for the United States.
Yeah, it's worse. You're right. I mean, that is what too few are willing to admit, is that it is worse right now under Joe Biden. And for me, even when you had the Trump administration during his term pass things like the Taipei Act, which was a big act of aggression toward China, almost legitimizing Taiwan's participation in international organizations. Huge. That's an aggressive move. So is pulling out of all of the treaties that surrounded Russia, like the INF. Huge, that's pretty aggressive. However, it was all constrained. It was all singular moves that were constrained by a political environment where Donald Trump was seen as more of a problem than an asset politically. So when he was an asset, he would be praised. But there were not too many times where that was the case. A lot of the times it was just his very presence, which was seen as embarrassing. And so there was a lot of, you could say, stagnation and an inability for the U.S. National security state and its foreign policy establishment to come to any kind of agreements that would move things forward in a unified and in a methodical manner. Now, under Biden, it's been quite methodical. We've seen the ways in which the Biden administration has so-called organized these alliances, whether it's NATO or whether it's in the Asia Pacific, to really ramp up this two-pronged new Cold War with Russia and China. And we did not have a special military operation in Ukraine happening, nor the kind of response under the Trump administration that the Biden administration has okayed. And most of that was facilitated by Biden and the Obama administration, and now the Biden administration. So there's so many things that the Democratic Party has made worse, just pushing so hard, pushing the Republicans off a political cliff, really, when it comes to foreign policy and domestic policy. And then what I think surprises more people is the China approach, because there was a time where there were divides about, well, who do you go after first, Russia or China? Okay, well, we've weakened Russia enough, so we can kind of just hedge our bets on China. Now that the foreign policy establishment is like, no, we need to go after both. This is the first time in history that NATO has said Russia and China is a threat collectively. And we've had this pattern with U.S. dominated institutions occurring over the past several years, and Biden has made it a lot worse. So I mean, this video about nuclear, a potential nuclear catastrophe, you're 100% right. That is definitely underlying it, a message about how so-called U.S. adversaries are going to drop a bomb on us, not at all mentioning the fact that the United States right now is instigating two possible points of nuclear catastrophe. One, through its involvement and its suicidal involvement in Ukraine, not allowing for diplomacy. And then I mean, any person who likes the thought of peace, who does any research about what's happening with how the United States has dealt with the Taiwan question, even just in the last year or 2 years, will say, wow, that is not a good idea. That looks like a nuclear exchange waiting to happen between two big powers. Maybe we should stop that. The Biden administration has not done any such thing. And so there is both, I think, a level of just absolute opportunism and militarism going on, and then a lot of stupidity. This is really not going to go well for the very empire that wants to expand and wants to contain China. You push too far on this question, and we're likely to get buried. And I remember in late February, March, when Russia's operation started, there were a lot of people asking me, hey, is this the time we're going to get where there's going to be nuclear warfare? And they were all thinking that Russia was going to do it to us. There was no thought about, well, maybe it's the United States is, the only country in the world to drop multiple nuclear weapons. Maybe, just maybe, it could be the fault of the United States. But I'll stop there.
Well, you're right. It's like there's always some other bad guy. But the Biden administration, they backtracked, but a few weeks ago, maybe a month or so ago, they started to change the language of foreign policy. The one China policy was settled for 50 years, more than 50 years. There's one China, Taiwan's part of China, and they were looking like they were going to recognize Taiwan. And people called them on it, and they said, no, actually, we're not going to do that. But I'm sure they will. And but it doesn't seem to matter that their plan to wreck what did they say, that we're going to turn the ruble into rubble? But the ruble has gained in value, by the way, and their plot to destroy Russia's economy has not worked. But a lot of them want to double down. We don't have enough sanctions against Russia. So they're going to turn the rest of the world into rubble economically, at the very least. And they seem to think, they believe in this brinkmanship, and that ultimately another country is going to blink. Why would they? These are existential threats. Ukraine was used to attack Russia. I mean, it could have been literally used to attack Russia. They wanted to get their and they want to get their hands on Russia's resources. They want to break Russia up. This, talk about delusional. And they even talked about decolonizing Russia. Now they've invented these groups who, don't be surprised if there are terrorist attacks in Russia coming up, that Moscow is controlling. I mean, it's a vast country. It's huge. And there are people who don't really want to be in Russia. These are all lies. But we can see where it's headed. But Russia has been patient all these years, and far from being this, villain bent on destroying the U.S., Putin has tried diplomacy. He tries to talk to them. Xi Jinping apparently told Biden the last time they spoke, we have these conversations, and then when the meeting's over, it's if we didn't talk. Yep. So they've had it. They're like, enough. And I don't know why anybody thinks they're not going to be resolute, because the U.S. is talking about destroying them as countries, about bringing Russia back to the bad old days of the 90s, when oligarchs really ran Russia, because U.S. friend Yeltsin was in power, and trying to undo the power of the Chinese Communist Party. It is lunacy. So they're going to fight back, and I'm hoping they have better sense than people in Washington, who, whether they're trying to or not, could get us all killed.
Yeah, and if you read the Chinese media, and everyone should be reading media that comes from Russia and China, let go of your prejudices, everyone. In order to understand what's happening around the world, you have to read media that comes from the countries that you're trying to understand. So do that. And when you read Chinese media, for example, CGTN, Global Times, it's always a message that's in there. Like, we've had conversations. They just had a huge conversation between huge top level officials, of course, the NSA, National Security Advisor, and Wang Yi, I believe it was, who's at the top of the foreign ministry. They had hours long conversation. They always say it was productive when we were talking, and then the media will say, well, is the U.S. going to actually do anything about what we've talked about? Will it end the trade war? Will it stop with these ridiculous sanctions? Will it pull back from this dangerous encirclement? Will it stop violating the one China policy? Will it abide by decades old treaties that were signed between the two countries? Treaties of which, one of which says literally, United States is eventually going to stop militarizing Taiwan, right? Like, that's kind of the language. It's like, you're going to do that, right? You're going to continue. You're not going to spend more. This was, I think, 1982. You're not going to spend more on militarizing. You're not going to send more weapons to Taiwan than you did the previous year, right? No, wrong. It's been more and more and more every single year for like 2 generations now. So the United States doesn't uphold its end of the bargain. It doesn't want diplomacy. It is seeking war without victory. And I think that is incredibly dangerous. And Margaret, I know you have a very tight deadline, so there's a couple minutes left if you want to close out the conversation.
Well, thanks, Danny. Just remind everybody to read blackagendareport.com every Wednesday, where Danny and I, you can see our work, listen to Black Agenda Radio on Fridays on our website. Danny has his Patreon up. I also have one, patreon.com/Margaret Kimberley. And we're both on Twitter. Look us up, and we will see you again soon. Thanks a lot, Danny.
Yeah. So this was a briefer stream today, but I think we got a lot in, and all of those links are actually in the description of the video. And I just sent the main Black Agenda Report link, so you all can get caught up, subscribe, get caught up to the last issue. All right, everyone. Well, before you leave, make sure you like this stream. If you have not yet, make sure you subscribe to the channel, all of that good stuff. Hit the notifications bell, and we will see you again very soon. Bye-bye.
Peace.